Yesterday we introduced the debate between biblical minimalism and biblical maximalism, looked at how our worldview assumptions affect how we go about thinking about the biblical data and explaining it. And we started looking along this timeline, starting with Genesis 1:1, looking a little bit at the Eden passage about the 4 rivers that have now been discovered in recent time through satellite imagery, and going on from Abram as he originally was, through to Joseph being sold off by his brothers into Egypt. So here we are in Egypt, and in this session we're going to look at the Exodus to the Conquest narratives from Egypt to the Promised Land. So in terms of biblical geography, we had Abram coming out of Ur, down here probably, or maybe one of the Urs up here, settling in Haran, ending up down in Israel area. Joseph sold off into slavery in Egypt. Now, of course, we get the story of coming back out of Egypt into the Promised Land. So I'm going to peg Moses in the 13th century BC. There is an in-house Christian discussion about dating of the Exodus. One school of thought would put it in the 15th century, around about 1446-ish. Another school of thought would put it in the 13th century, around about 1260-ish. And there are probably a few other more fringe schools on the dating as well. But I'm going to go with the 13th century dating. If you want to get into the discussions about the dating, this book, The Exodus, 5 Views on the Exodus, is a debate book where people with different interpretations of the Exodus narratives discuss that with each other, including the issue of the dating. Here are also a bunch of books that I would recommend on the topic. James Hoffmeyer is a well-known Egyptologist, as is Kenneth Kitchen. Did I Not Bring Israel Out of Egypt is a collection of papers from a conference, and so on. You'll find lots more resources in the handout that you have electronically alongside a copy of the slides. It's about 98% what I'm showing you. So we talked a little bit about Richard Dawkins yesterday, and Dawkins has something to say, as you'd expect, on the Exodus here. He says that you would think that such a big event as the enslavement of an entire nation and its mass migration generations later would have left traces in the archaeological record and in the written histories of Egypt. Unfortunately, there is no evidence of either kind. No evidence of anything like a Jewish captivity in Egypt. It probably never happened, although the legend is burned deep into Jewish culture. Now, there's various interesting things that you could address within that. One is, we introduced yesterday this idea of the criteria of embarrassment. Would Jewish scribes in the exile period in Babylon in, say, the 5th century BC, would they have made up a story in which the origin of their nation was as slaves? Is that a probable origin story to kind of make up and get accepted by your culture? Also notice we talked yesterday quite a lot about the difficulty of making arguments from silence that make an undisciplined shift from we have no evidence for X to therefore that is evidence against the truth of X. And those arguments are notoriously risky. And in history, people who tend to make those sort of arguments, as we saw even from an evangelical commentary on the Eden passage that we looked at, in our experience, very often get undermined by people later then discovering the relevant evidence. So, and of course, as I said, the further back in time you are, the less likely that evidence of an event that did happen would A, survive intact until now, and B, have been discovered. And we looked at some of the data on how spare and porous our access to the past through its known remains are, both in terms of written and archaeological history. So arguments from silence like this are really weak. Argument from silence. Well, this is a fresco from the tomb of Vizier Rickmeyer in Egypt from the 15th century BC. They're painted on the walls of the Theban tomb of Rickmeyer, who was an Egyptian vizier or prime minister. And these scenes, this is a close-up of this panel here. These scenes depict Nubian and Semitic ethnic slaves making mud bricks. Of course, the Exodus narratives records that the Jews were employed as making mud bricks as slaves in Egypt. But certainly we have evidence that there were people of Semitic origin who were slaves in Egypt before the date of the Exodus, whenever you put that. Professor Joshua Berman notes multiple allusions in the Exodus narrative that he thinks strikingly appear to reflect the realities of late second millennium BCE Egypt. We looked at this concept yesterday of historical verisimilitude, or getting the culture right. Getting the culture right in a way that is unlikely if you're just making up stories hundreds and hundreds of years later, as I jokingly put it, without access to Wikipedia, to get your facts right. Not that Wikipedia always gets its facts right, but there we go. But there are elements of this Exodus narrative that does appear to reflect the realities of late second millennium Egypt, which a scribe living centuries later and inventing the story afresh would have been unlikely to know. Berman says from the form of the tabernacle in the wilderness, which he argues is based on the portable throne tent of Ramesses II, to the use of terminology like God taking the Israelites out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, which has precedence in ancient Egyptian literature. Berman believes that the Torah is full of cultural allusions which would have been deeply meaningful for contemporary Jewish forebears, but which can now only be understood through the lens of academic research. Academic research that would not have been available to Jewish scribes in the exile or thereafter. Theologians Scott Hahn and Curtis Mitch, for example, note that Exodus displays a knowledge of the Egyptian agricultural calendar, the use of acacia wood, which is indigenous to parts of Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, but which isn't found in Palestine. They say it's difficult to believe that authors in post-exilic Palestine could have known and accurately portrayed the conditions of second millennia Egypt. The Brooklyn Papyrus is one of the few surviving scraps of papyrus from ancient Egypt. It comes from the 18th century BC. And while all the documents of the Nile Delta have rotted, we don't have any. So Dawkins saying you'd expect it to be mentioned in the written records. Well, for example, all of the documents from the Nile Delta region have rotted. This document from the south of Egypt lists dozens of slaves, including names that appear in the Bible, like Shiphrah, which is the same name as a Hebrew midwife in the Exodus account. Now, no, I'm not saying this document refers to the person who's in Exodus. What I'm saying is this document refers to people in Exodus who had names that are the same as we get in the Exodus account. Those kind of names of people, of that kind of people group, were in Egypt. Extra-biblical evidence shows us. It includes names like Shiphrah, Asher, Menem, and Ishkar, which are the ones in red highlighted there. In the Did I Not Bring Israel Out of Egypt collection, Benjamin Noonan argues that given that at least some of the Egyptian loan words in the Exodus and wilderness narratives were borrowed during the Late Bronze Age, it is likely that the events of these narratives took place in the Late Bronze Age, just as one would expect if they represent authentic history. There are words in the narrative that are borrowed from Egyptian culture. Edwin Umarchi notes that the similarity of the Mosaic covenant to the Hittite suzerainty treaties, which date from the 2nd millennium BC, has convinced many scholars of the antiquity of the Mosaic covenant. The form of these kinds of covenant changes over historical time. What order do you put you promise to do this if we do that, but if we don't live up to our end of the bargain, then you will punish us in the following way. What, order do these things come in? The kind of structure of covenants, they change over time. And the Exodus accounts gets the covenant structure right for its time period and place. Regarding Moses, Kitchin says that to explain what we have in our Hebrew documents, we need a Hebrew leader who had experience of life at the Egyptian court, because of the knowledge that is displayed there, including knowledge of treaty-type documents and their format, as well as traditional Semitic legal social usage. In other words, someone distressingly like Moses. And Kitchin notes that a tiny fraction of reports from the East Nile Delta occur in papyri recovered from the desert near Memphis. Otherwise, the entirety of Egypt's administrative records of all periods in the Delta are lost. And he notes that monumental texts on monumental buildings, are almost nil. And as pharaohs never monumentalize defeats on temple walls, the point of putting something on a temple wall was propaganda, not accurate news reporting, right? Kitchin argues that no record of a successful exit of a large bunch of foreign slaves with the full loss of a chariot squadron would ever have been memorialized. So an argument from silence only works when the evidence is not there and you should expect to see the evidence, but it's not there. But Kitchin is arguing contra Dawkins that we wouldn't expect to see any written Egyptian evidence of an exodus. Either it did exist and it's been lost, or it wouldn't have existed in the first place. Archaeologist Thomas Davis disagrees with Dawkins' expectation of archaeological evidence of Jewish migration. And he's an expert in, this is from the Did I Not Bring Israel Out of Egypt book. He has a chapter in there. He's an expert on looking for signs of nomadic camps in the desert. And he says the formation process that affects archaeological data in remote desert environments such as Sinai, and the nature of the archaeological signature of a migratory group force a reassessment of this negative conclusion. Interestingly, Stephen Mosher and James K. Hoffmeyer used information combined from geology, archaeology, and digital topography and satellite imagery to reconstruct a map of the Eastern Nile Delta and Sinai Peninsula as it would have been in the Bronze Age. And then they compared that map to the description of the Exodus accounts. And they argue that the restored geography provides a plausible map of the region that is described in the Exodus texts. There's obviously kind of a lot of detailed comparison to go in there. I just give you the headline of their research. Here is their map of the physical geography of that area. So there were Semites who were slaves in Egypt. There wouldn't have been Egyptian records, and it's implausible to expect archaeological data, even if it's there. No one's dug over the whole place. But what about coming into the promised land. Does that give us any evidence? Let's look at Jericho. Jericho is one of the oldest known human settlements, dating from around 9000 BC. The Middle Bronze Age so-called City 4 has fallen walls and evidence of fire. But recent research confirms that that destruction dates from around about 1550 BC. This does not match with a 15th century so-called early Exodus date of around about 1450. But what about the other Exodus date, 13th century one? Well, Bart Ehrman, in his book, The Bible, A Historical and Literary Introduction, he says that Jericho was not inhabited in the late 13th century BCE, as archaeologists have decisively shown. So the conquest story, wherever you peg it historically, seems to be in trouble, right? Only the minimalist archaeologist Professor Lorenzo Negro, in a 2020 research, notes that in the late Bronze 2B era of Jericho, that is about 1300 to 1200 BC, the site was still occupied. Kenyon uncovered dwellings dating to this period, and it seems clear that the so-called middle building in Jericho was still in use. Late Bronze 2B layers were heavily cut by levelling operations carried out in the Iron Age as people rebuild upon the same mound. And this explains the scarcity of the 13th century materials. So yes, 13th century materials are scarce, but we know why that is from the archaeology, and there is evidence from the 13th century of occupation of Jericho at that time period. More recently, Negro wrote that in 2023, he says, analysis of the archaeological remains associated with the late Bronze Age at Jericho suggests that Jericho was still a flourishing city, smaller than the previous Canaanite city, with a lower density in population. It was still a fortified city. This term that you'll see it translated in English translations of the Bible, at least, as city. In some circumstances, a better translation might be government fort. It gives you a better picture of what's going on. People lived in the surrounding areas and farmed and did whatever. They didn't live in the city. The city was there to exert government control over the area, protect a trade route, that kind of thing. It was still a fortified city, but the fortifications were characterized by the reuse of the most impressive structures of the Middle Bronze Age 3 from earlier. Finally, the middle building does not preserve the monumentality of the previous Jericho palaces. The middle building is the residence of a local governor, a vassal of the Egyptian Empire. As Hans Christensen summarizes, the most recent excavators at Jericho demonstrate that Jericho was still occupied in the late Bronze 2B, that is around 1300 to 1200 BC, which is when many scholars date the conquest. Archaeologists also found a late Bronze Age mud brick wall and a destruction layer that could be dated to the late Bronze Age. However, due to the dating difficulties of the destruction layer, I don't think we can take the archaeological remains as clearly confirming or contradicting the biblical battle at Jericho. It's just, at the moment at least, with our present ways of knowing things, too difficult, given the available data. So the upshot of this is the evidence is consistent with the biblical narrative if you pin it in the 13th century. David Ben Shlomo and Ralph K. Hawkins, in a Biblical Archaeology Review, BAR, article in 2018, note that when Iron Age 1 sherds, like pottery shards, bits of pottery, were found at 69 sites in the Jordan Valley, most of which were founded on virgin soil where there had been no preceding settlements, it seemed to contradict the idea of indigenous demographic shifting and suggested instead the entry of a new population groups from outside the land. I mentioned this briefly yesterday. Some people who doubt the Exodus narrative will say, when did the Jewish people become a people? When did Israel become Israel? And they say maybe it happened when there was a kind of shift in the indigenous population some of them came together and formed this new nation from people already within the land. And these guys are saying maybe this evidence doesn't easily square with that idea. They say the rise in settlements in the Jordan Valley was clearly part of a settlement phenomena that spanned both sides of the Jordan River during the transition from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age, a phenomenon that was probably connected with the tribes of Israel. Archaeologist John Currid notes that during the 12th through 11th centuries BC, many small settlements emerged in Israel, and many of these were occupied for the first time. He says it's tempting to attribute this influx of settlements to the Israelites. I remember yesterday me saying, we don't get knockdown arguments in history and archaeology. It's often a matter of what's the balance of evidence? What's the most plausible interpretation given everything we think we know? David Purish notes that the so-called four-room house, some examples here, a distinctive home floor plan. It appears suddenly throughout Israel at precisely the same time as the Hebrews supposedly entered the Promised Land. And then we have the famous Merneptah stele. A stele is like a monument stone with propaganda written on it. This one is dated from about 1205, 1208-ish. The Merneptah stele is an extra-biblical record of a people group called Israel, mentioned on this stone. It was set up by Pharaoh Merneptah to commemorate various military victories in Canaan. And part of it proclaims, Ashkelon is carried off, and Gezer is captured, Yehonim is made into non-existence, Israel is wasted, his seed is not. Now, this is typical hyperbole in the report of warfare in the ancient Near East. And there's a whole interesting discussion about the interpretation, particularly of the book of Joshua's report of Israel's warfare, and how literalistically one should read those reports given the cultural context, and given that you will find verses in the biblical text that say things like, the Israelites went and fought a battle against the people from this city, and they killed all of them. Not a person was left. And then the survivors of the city went and escaped to so-and-so. You think, okay, either this author is really confused, or maybe their way of talking about warfare is a bit analogous to our modern way sometimes of talking about sports. My team absolutely slaughtered the opposition. Well, we got one more goal than they did. Right. So that kind of reading maybe helps us make better internal sense of the biblical data, that if you try and read it all literalistically seems to contradict itself. But if you realize that maybe some of the data is meant literally and some of it is meant hyperbolically, then you don't get that internal contradiction. And noting that this is how ancient societies in that cultural context reported battle, like Merneptah saying, Yehonim is made into non-existence and Israel is wasted, his seed is not. Of course, we know that Israel was not wasted and his seed was not. Some people try and argue that that's maybe talking about their harvest seed has been destroyed. I don't buy that. I think there are no Israelites anymore. Woohoo! And of course there were, but that's just like biblical passages that say we completely killed everybody from this city and then the survivors escaped somewhere else. And they still exist in the land, even though early on it said we completely conquered them. You know. Yehonim are followed by an Egyptian hieroglyph that designates a town. So the town of Yehonim is made into non-existence. But Israel is followed by a hieroglyph that means a people, not a town. So the people Israel is made into non-existence. So that pegs there was a people group known by people in surrounding culture, in Egypt at least, as the Israelites in Israel, in the Canaanite region by 1205, 1208.